Leave granted. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr President. I won't give a full second reading speech on these bills, but I do ask, Mr President, that the bills be voted on sequentially, which is the tradition that we've adopted since the 2013 budget. And the reason for that, as all honourable members will know, is that in the Budget Measures Bill of 2013 was a measure dealing with industrial relations and public sector wages that this House had twice rejected in legislative form. And the government of the day hid the measure in the Budget Measures Bill to slip it through, because the tradition of this House is that the appropriation bills and the bills that are cognate with it are not interrupted or held up. It's nearly 5 o'clock on the Thursday and the last sitting day until August, last sitting day of the financial year, and of course the tradition of this House is not to hold up the budget. But that tradition was abused, and so since then we've asked for the bills to be voted on sequentially so that we can examine them more closely. And this year, again, in the middle of the Budget Measures Bill, in Schedule 5, is a measure that is wholly unrelated to the budget, about restructuring an important public sector agency. Landcom, known as Urban Growth, is to be dismembered and a number of the staff transferred into the public service into a development corporation in the Premier's portfolio. Now, that policy had been announced some time ago, but there'd been no consultation with staff or the recognised trade union. And over the last 10 months, the organisation has been subject to a review, again without engaging the input of the staff, and the uncertainty and paralysis that has beset the organisation has caused something like 60 of its 230 staff to resign, including the former CEO and several senior managers, just paralysing the urban transformation organisation of this government for reasons that are not well understood. So that measure does those things. It shouldn't be in the budget papers. It should be dealt with as a separate and substantive policy issue. But this government has chosen to put it in the budget papers, and we will deal with it. In transferring the staff from what is currently a state-owned corporation to a budget sector agency, will, without other measures, cause the paying conditions of those staff working at Landcom, known as Urban Growth, to be cut because they are outside current wage-setting parameters. And there are some protections in the bill, but not for everyone. And the Secretary of the Premier's Department went and addressed the staff at Urban Growth and gave them the distinct impression that all of them would receive a 2-year protection of their current wages and conditions, and that is not what this bill does. This bill provides that protection to those who are permanent employees or ongoing employees, but does not provide that same protection to contract employees, that is, employees who are on time-limited contracts, and it does not protect senior managers, who, although they are designated as senior managers and are well paid, these are the people who are charged with the responsibility of delivering hundreds of millions of dollars worth of public infrastructure, and have the responsibility for doing that. And I think it's important that whether they are line workers or managers, we should respect all those in our greater public sector who do work in the public interest, including at Landcom. And so we have proposed some amendments that give them the much needed protections. Now, there's been a lot of discussion across the Parliament about this, and I understand that the government will have its own amendment that will deal with that issue, which we will support, and I will not move any one of my 4 amendments that were directed to those concerns that I have outlined, including the forcible transfer of employees, which we don't think is appropriate. But and I thank the crossbench parties, all of the crossbench parties, for engaging actively on this issue, and I do thank the government for embracing the amendment that it will now move, because I think that is, yes, I acknowledge the role of Paul Green of the Christian Democratic Party, but all of the crossbench parties have played a role in getting us to this position, and I do think that is very important. So that is something that we will deal with in more detail when we get into the committee stage. The Fire and Emergency Services Levy Bill. Now, this was a piece of legislation that was described in the Australian newspaper by a senior government source as the greatest tax reform in New South Wales history, quote unquote. And in this bill that's before the House, the government is repealing their own legislation only a few weeks later. They've been working on it since 2012, was when the first discussion paper came out. The government was warned that the modelling would lead to the imposition of hardships and extra cost on households that should not be bearing those costs. The government didn't listen. It legislated in the face of the opposition of many of those in this chamber, and now they're having to support the repeal of their own legislation, and we would urge them to consult closely in terms of getting it right going forward. Turning to the substance of the budget, I note that in the 6 years of this government, state taxation revenue has increased by 53%, from $20 billion to $31 billion. At the same time, they've privatised $50 billion worth of public assets. That sounds like a lot of money. It is. Except you realise the public are being shortchanged. Take the LPI. They're selling it for $3 billion, the right to the revenue stream, the regulated revenue stream of a monopoly service provider. There's no risk to a purchaser. They're buying it for $3 billion, except the revenue stream is worth $5.2 billion. It's easy to sell a $5.2 billion asset for $3 billion. $3 billion sounds like a lot, but it's not much more than half the value. And the same shortchanging has occurred with the privatisation of the electricity assets and the other privatisations engaged in by this government. Sounds like a lot of cash, but in fact it's shortchanging the community. That you can only sell it once, and those dividends, that revenue stream is worth much more in the hands of the government delivering basic services than the one-off sugar hit of the cash injection. And in fact, if you take out the one-off privatisation proceeds from the budget, where they say they're $4.5 billion in surplus, and you take out the dodgy accounting trick to do with the transport asset holding entity, legislated by this parliament a few months ago. It's a dodgy accounting trick to make the government spending look lower than it is and to improve the budget bottom line. The fact is, if you strip away the tahi and you strip away the one-off privatisations, the structural position of this budget is far from sound. But I won't delay the House here with the details. It's a theme we will return to in the near future. The opposition leader in the other place has given a comprehensive speech, and I won't delve into those details, but I will mention electricity prices. This government has done everything it can to drive up power prices. In 2013, it sold Mount Piper and Wallerawang power stations without making the new private owner keep the power going into our community. And this placed New South Wales at risk earlier this year. The 1,000 megawatts of energy generated by Wallerawang would have meant that we were not at any risk, and it did place us at risk. At the same time, the government has dragged its feet on renewable energy. Its war against wind power is well known. It took them 6 years to get their planning department guidelines in shape. In 2014, the government sold Bayswater and Liddell power stations to AGL, even though the competition watchdog said it would narrow competition, and of course we know that less competition means higher prices. They deregulated electricity prices in 2014, and within months the big retailers were charging 2 to 3 times more to sell electricity in New South Wales than the regulated retailer in the ACT. And of course there's also the carbon market economics report, which showed that within 12 months of deregulation the retailers were charging 10 to 15% more, and of course other increases have come through since, and of course customers are now facing increases of up to 19% from 1 July. And of course, in the face of all of this, the government has confirmed today they will continue with the deregulation of regulated retail gas prices from 1 July. It's just extraordinary. And of course, for the last 2 years, they've been in court stopping the energy regulator cutting the network prices, which would reduce energy costs to households of $300 a year and businesses of $523 a year. Over the regulated period, customers could have saved $6 billion, but this government wanted to keep the money in those companies because they were privatising them. They wanted to get top dollar. So those are some of the things. And of course, we have announced that we will put the electricity companies and the government on notice, and we will re-regulate electricity companies to ensure that consumers are treated fairly, and we will eliminate energy company super profits to make sure electricity is more affordable for families.
Nationalise them. Go the full Corbyn.
We will also use the proceeds for the transfer of Snowy Hydro to invest in renewable generation projects across regional New South Wales, and we won't just have a proportion of that sale of Snowy Hydro's interest, the New South Wales interest in Snowy Hydro to the federal government. We'll put a 100% of the proceeds into regional communities. And we will legislate to make sure the IPART recommended rate for the solar feed-in tariff is made mandatory. Those are things that we are proposing in the energy space, and the government in question time said that we were borrowing some of their projects that they already had underway. Projects which, by the way, they hadn't put a press release out about, they hadn't made a public announcement about. Well, why don't they adopt the rest of our energy policies? And we would welcome that. We will invest in infrastructure for Western Sydney. We will put the interests of Western Sydney's 3 million residents against the interests of 300,000 Northern Beaches residents by accelerating the Western Metro project, a new railway line for Western Sydney. Under this government, there has been a butchery of TAFE. In 2011-12, nearly $1 billion was taken out of TAFE and it hasn't been put back. There are 63,000 fewer students in TAFE today, and now 500 more TAFE teacher positions are being axed in this budget, taking the total number of teachers in TAFE axed to 5,700. We will require 15% of jobs on New South Wales government construction projects valued at over $500,000 to be allocated to apprentices, trainees, Indigenous Australians and the long-term unemployed. We'll create thousands of new jobs for trainees and apprentices, and we will rebuild TAFE by guaranteeing at least 70% of vocational education and training funding for TAFE is invested in that important institutions. There are so many other areas that need looking at. This government is building 60% fewer schools than the last Labor government did, and we will remedy that. We will also deliver on affordable housing. The current Premier made that a flagship of her leadership, but so far the government has failed to deliver any meaningful policy. We will require mandatory affordable housing targets and deliver thousands of new homes every year for those on low to middle incomes, and 25% of dwellings constructed on government-owned land being redeveloped will be designated as affordable housing, and there is a range of other measures which we have already announced as well. We will pursue measures to protect our environment, and I note the inaugural speech of Mr Taylor Martin yesterday denouncing our regional $100 million package for his home of the Central Coast. We make no apologies for investing valuable resources in regional communities, whether it's the Central Coast or the North Coast. We have plans in health. We will pursue those in more detail, both during the budget take note debate and, of course, during budget estimates. But those are our comments. We will, as a matter of tradition, not vote against these bills, but that should not be mistaken for supporting them. And as I've indicated, there are some amendments that we will attend to in this place. Mr Chair.
Further